What's happening, y'all? We're back. If all goes according to plan, the name of this video will be short, sweet, and pointless. I'm not really trying to communicate any message with this video. I'm just trying to provide some content, which I've been sort of slacking on recently, and I'm sorry for that. I have my reasons, and I have made attempts to make videos in the intervals between those that I post, and some of them just not up to my standard, not really satisfying to me. I do usually listen to my recordings before posting them, and if they don't meet my expectation or surpass my expectation, sometimes I do better than I realize, and I like when that happens. But this is just, I'm not really competing against myself or trying to say anything to you guys in particular. Basically, I'm just going to have my breakfast, which is basically just sort of like some snacks. It's not really a legitimate breakfast, but while I do that, I have this pile of books, of editions of my favorite authors, some of my favorite authors, and I thought I would just, one by one, not comment on the particular books that they write, but on the authors themselves and why I like them, and they're some of my favorites. So, to begin with, I'm looking at, and those who know, please correct me, my German is not the best. I'm looking at Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And when I encounter English speakers who speak about him, I usually hear Goethe with this sort of hard R. And the way I just did it was Goethe, which is, it may sound almost like there's an R there, but it's this strange German pronunciation of the OE. And I'll have to do the same thing with the next one, which is Jakob Burma. But to speak about Goethe, incredibly influential author to me, and perhaps the most gracious writing style I've ever come across, and that just pervades basically everything he's ever written that I have read. Everything he says seems to exude the spirit of liberation and freedom that, in Nietzsche's words, he poetizes everything there is to speak about in human existence or existence itself, and just has this incredibly gracious manner of communicating through the written word. And one has the sense in reading him that he is as liberated a human consciousness as human consciousness can probably get, seeing as there are no ways for us really to measure how enlightened or free a person is. And one has this sense in that, as I said, he speaks in this highly effectual and captivating manner that just grabs the reader who is at all aware of what is in front of them as they're looking into any of his books. And I don't know if I've ever been disappointed by anything that I picked up from him, whether it be his prose and his essays or the Faust drama parts 1 and 2, The Sorrows of Young Werther, which might be my favorite, and I would like to dedicate a video just to Werther, which is very important book to my mind, and there's controversy surrounding that book because it led to a sort of mass suicidal crisis where readers of The Sorrows of Young Werther were, as a consequence of reading that book, apparently inclined to kill themselves, and that many people would kill themselves in the 18th century, I believe, when Goethe had been alive, and they would kill themselves in ode to Goethe and his book, or with the book somewhere near them when they commit the fatal act, or the book, in a word, came to be associated with many suicides in real life, in human history at that time. And of course, those who have read the Epistolary Novel, which epistolary just means it's a novel that is in the format of a series of written letters. Werther, the protagonist, in summation, fell in love with this lady who had been married and deeply in love with her, and telling this to the person he was corresponding with by letter, just how insanely in love he was with this lady, and how he just could never have her, and ultimately it just became too much for him to bear, and he killed himself, which is how the book ends. Sorry for the spoiler, but there you have it. Even having spoiled the ending, somebody who has not read it and is hearing me speak about it now and goes to read it, you will not be disappointed, and it will be a book that has probably a major impact on you. And so, I had two main reasons for why one has this sense in reading Goethe that he is as free a human being as a human being could possibly have gotten, for all we can know. The first was, I commented on the graciousness or grace of his style, which is undeniable and pours through everything he ever wrote, but also in his capacity to explain and describe the many facets of self-conscious human existence, or also just human history, and in general the things that we as people interact with in the world, from the inmost to the outmost. He had this unusual ability to put into effectual word that moves the reader the most secret happenings of a self-conscious existence, but also the most plain and ordinary happenings of the everyday world that we all share as a society. All of it, he could attain to an objective enough attitude to explain and describe beautifully and remarkably in a way that is incredibly impressive. And he has been and will remain one of my favorite writers of all time. if not the most. And I guess I have a problem with selecting any one writer as absolute favorite. I have multiple favorites, each of them for different reasons, and each has their own sort of signatures and distinctions that make them them, and they're irreplaceable, and you can't mock what they do, which is part of the beauty of it. And it's amazing that their thoughts and essentially their spiritual life has been documented in written word, and we are so fortunate to have the ability to be able to get these books. And so the next one I have here is Jakob Burma, and to tell you the truth, I haven't read all that much of him, but for those who don't know, he's a Christian mystic. If I am not wrong, he lived at about the same time as Goethe and another German writer, or Swiss, or some German-speaking writer, and he too has a manner of writing in a way that exudes or suggests liberated consciousness, because he is able to speak about all of the shackles, as it were, and chains that in our world, in our life, stand to imprison us as human beings and to muddy and corrupt our consciousness. He has a way of speaking about these things and asserting that we need not settle for that shackled and imprisoned sort of existence, but that one may attain to God, or consciousness of God, a renunciation of what he would call the creaturely or barbarous will, and resting confidently and assuredly in what he would call the divine will, or the Spirit of God himself. And from a young age, I have always had this sort of salvational, soteriological interest, mostly to begin with in a sort of unconscious way that I wasn't quite aware of, but then as I began to encounter people like this, and even apart from authors and writing, just encountering people who tacitly and non-verbally sort of gave me cues that they had insight into the possibility of human consciousness being imprisoned, enslaved to all sorts of meager things and people and ideas, and that this need not happen, but that one can be liberated from all of those chains that the world has to offer, and that even our own thoughts and emotions have to offer. Is that's, if you will, these inner enemies are the sorts of culprits that show again and again in world religions all over the globe, and you can sum them up basically in a word, like in Buddhism: desire, or craving, or strife. And the tragedy is that oftentimes, instinctually, people will try to solve the problem of craving, desire, emotionality, wretched thoughts and feelings in their solitude by not increasing their solitude, but rather by diminishing it or eliminating it completely by slavishly devoting themselves to all of these kinds of servitudes that the world has to offer, or to people who want you to bow down to them and for you to follow their commands. I can't remember who it was I was reading recently, but it's a recurring theme that not only this person had said, that it was probably Jung, because I've just started reading Answer to Job, and that's one of the books I'll bring up here soon. But he said that humans are constantly doing everything they can to forego their freedom, or to relinquish it, to give it up to somebody or to some ideology or some party or some meager and frankly bullshit kind of substitute for liberation. That's a Aldous Huxleyan phrase that I like to bring in, because I think that's an adequate way of putting the problem that human beings not realizing the possibility of attaining to greater solitude or higher consciousness, a higher mode of being, oblivious to this possibility, go and do those very things that make that attainment impossible. And those who remain open to, for instance, poetry and religion, tend to be the ones who don't so easily settle for the lower existence, but are still sensitive to the possibility of a higher existence and perhaps even already live there. And Jakob Burma, along with Goethe, are both gentlemen who I think so plainly and obviously attained to a higher mode of being, however they both did it. And read any of their writings, it will just come across through so much of what they say, either in a direct or indirect and tacit sort of fashion, that constantly, almost sentence by sentence, they're pointing you to insights that you need to evade or avoid spiritual imprisonment and servitude to things that are not spiritual and lofty and noble, or the highest. They point you to the highest, if you will, is the sense that I get. And it is, as Christ says, not of this world. My kingdom is not of this world. And in their own ways, Goethe and Burma both say very similar things. Next on the list, Rainer Maria Rilke. Or in the anglicized English, you can say Rainer Maria Rilke. You might know it that way. Again, another individual who, being familiar with the possibility of spiritual enslavement to things that are not spiritual and things that are low and impoverished, did not settle for that slavery of the soul, but rather made every possible effort he could to elevate his soul and that of others as well, to awaken people to their souls. And again, read any of his writings, whether it be his letters, or the one Malta Laureates Briggs. I can't remember exactly the title, or even the name for that matter, in that title. I haven't read that one. I've read his Duino Elegies and a lot of his letters, not only letters to a young poet, but also this is another edition of his letters. And if you ask me, his letters are perhaps my favorite format of all of his writings. He also has some prose, sort of experimental writings that aren't poems per se, but that are outright poetic from start to finish. And just with Goethe, perhaps the most refreshing voice I've ever come across. And what's cool about reading authors like this in particular is that their voice is to you audible, or it becomes more audible and real as you progress through their readings. Even if you're not somebody who reads aloud, I, for one, don't really read aloud when I'm alone. I've tried that before when I was beginning reading, and I felt like, I'm just not understanding everything. Maybe this will work. I'll try this way of reading. And that didn't last very long. The inner thing, just the letting your eyes survey the pages and to just let them go across the words that are presented on the pages and just consider what comes up in your mind as you do so. Just gradually take what considerations come to you as you read things and just go from there. I mean, you don't have to really do all that much to consider new things as you read something, especially if it's something new that you've never read before. The considerations arise themselves insofar as you have read what has been stated clearly and have assessed the components of what has been written and the feel of it, the tone, all of these things. Considerations themselves should just begin to arise on their own, perfectly on their own for you, and you don't have to do all that much for that. I feel like sometimes we don't think that we're understanding very much, and we get frustrated and we'll just put down the book because we feel like we're not up to the level of the author. But really, we are so up to the level of these people if we just trusted ourselves and our minds to just investigate and penetrate in the natural way that they do, and in due time the understandings that we need and the considerations that we need will just begin to arise of themselves. And just to finish with Rilke, just another infinitely gracious author whose writings are very refreshing and freeing, and you feel yourself to be in immediate conversation with a rich and cultivated soul who's aware of the depths of the soul and just how nasty and dark it can be, but also how blissful and eternal it can be. Just familiarity with the human spirit itself, its greatness and its abomination, all of it, you get it from Rilke. And I could just speak on him endlessly, and it almost brings tears to my eyes just recalling some of the things that he says, in particular in his letters, but really all of his writings are just filled with highly sentimental utterances, and they affect you at the inmost depths of your being. That's been my experience anyway. Next on the list, Carl Jung. I've just started reading Answer to Job. I've read quite a few of his works, and only some of his collected works. About halfway through Eon, I read cover to cover Psychology and Alchemy, which is one of his more challenging works, and one must learn a great deal of mental and spiritual flexibility as one goes through that book, and a ton of looking up, for instance, mythologies that he invokes, or new words, Latin phrases, Greek phrases, research into the authors that he cites, study of the religious texts that he cites, and there's a lot of that going on in his books. And if you ask me, just from what I know so far about Jung and his work, he thought spiritual liberation and transcendence of life's suffering by attainment to the knowledge of God, or what may as well be God, in the human soul, that this is not just some outlandish and fantastic endeavor left to the few introverts at the outskirts of society, that it's only something that they do and that they really need. He thought spiritual liberation, spiritual freedom in the highest sense, to be a psychological need, and that the psyche is not quite functioning properly unless one does the work, the inner alchemical work necessary to get to that place of spiritual freedom and insight and realization, that this is an incredibly important work and goal for all people, but we tend to marginalize it and just say that, there's some spiritual and eccentric people on the outskirts of society, but as for spirituality, it's not really a big deal for the mass of men. They can go without it and the world will be just fine. No, Jung actually saw the salvation of the soul to be really the salvation of the world that we inhabit, and that society is the sum total of its individuals, and if its individuals are not ones but zeros, then we don't really have a society in the truest sense of that word, and we don't just become ones. We have to do some work for it in order for us to become valuable human beings. And if we don't do that inner spiritual work, then we'll remain zeros and be living a basically pointless existence, and it will show, because we'll become resentful and we'll be more destructive and senseless and mean and destructive, if I didn't say that already, than we have to be. And we could mitigate so much of that if people actually gave a damn about God and spirit. That's what I get from Jung's psychology. I almost forgot about my breakfast, because speaking about these people, to me, is so much fun, and there's infinite things I could say about them. But I'll probably end it here soon, because I wanted to put out something somewhat short, relative to my other videos and recent videos, that I love to just talk on and on about things that I consider important and valuable to you guys, but I realize you guys don't have all that much time probably, and it might be irritating for me to put out hour-long videos, but believe me, I could be doing 3-hour or however much longer, because there's just so much to be said that has not really been said about these people. Next, good old Nietzsche. And he, in his own peculiar way, was also sort of pointing a way to God or a new God without ever calling it God or saying that word, except in, forgive me if pronunciation is wrong, the Gott ist tot, God is dead. In German, people know him for that, and that became sort of a fashionable phrase that we hear a lot in public. That's mostly what he's known for, and thus people associate him with a sort of irreligion. But he has a whole book called Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft, which is the gay science, or also been translated the joyous wisdom. And, well, when he talks about free spirits and higher man, he is talking about individuals in particular who attain to a liberated and philosophic consciousness, that possibility exists in people. But as I was saying before, most people have a tendency to revert to things in the world or to worldly ideas and parties, associations, what have you, or give themselves to objects and things and sense experiences, even seek out emotional thrills, all sorts of ways that people try to imprison themselves, and they do so unwittingly because, as Huxley would say, they don't see self-consciousness to be the means to greater self-consciousness, that it's not for no reason that we are self-conscious, but it's for us to take up the challenge, so to speak, and to think about self-consciousness and what it could be, as opposed to what it is for us already when we naturally develop it, which we don't have to do any work to get. It just kind of comes to us and develops in us. But there is so much room for development on our part as subjects who can become conscious of more as we move through time, and as things reveal themselves to us, we can pay greater or lesser attention to them and be phenomenologically engaged with the reality that reveals itself to us as we move through life. The phenomenological motif of attentiveness to experience, the whole of experience and its many minute facets, is something that pours through Nietzsche's work, though he never uses the word phenomenology that I know of, but for perhaps a couple of occasions. I have not found him use that word yet, and I've read quite a lot of him. And yet, it just pours through his life, or rather through his writing, as I said about Goethe, that he writes in this incredibly gracious manner too, but he also is able, through writing, to objectify the many things that there are to notice or become aware of or attend to in self-conscious existence or in human life. Very skilled and able to speak about a whole vast range of things, and his range of topics of discussion is perhaps wider than any author I have encountered. It's close between him and Jung and even Goethe, but I would say Nietzsche and Jung went further because they attacked more the essayistic and prose format of writing, where we're talking about real world subjects and real things that happen in history or real things that we investigate in the world, whereas somebody like Goethe, though he does do those things as well, more so attacked the literary and poetic side, but also in so doing speaking about the host of things for a human being to become aware of and to experience in life. So I have two more that I'd like to go through quickly. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Another beautiful writing style, also able to speak about many different subjects. A fervent advocate of individuality and eccentricity, which I appreciate, and that's an attitude or a motif that I have cherished since I was very young. The free-spirited life, spiritual freedom of the individual, and that if one as individual has a sense of the sort of freedom that one can live or be or exist as or in or whatever you like, that one has every right to attain to that and to live a life there and not be ashamed what people have to say about it, because inevitably somebody who knows anybody who knows a little bit about the possible freedom that human beings can attain to, and that gets there as much as a human being can get there, it just inevitably shows through one's character. And anybody who reads Emerson's writings gets a very similar sense to that. I said I get when I read all of these other authors that I've mentioned already. Just relative to most of humanity, or the whole population of humanity, he is a considerably free human being, unashamed to speak his mind and to encourage others to not doubt themselves and to consider themselves unworthy of the highest existence, but rather encourages people to live in the manner of that highest existence, and that it's a sort of intuitive knowledge that people have, but that they deny in themselves, which is also a very Nietzschean motif. Nietzsche himself loved Emerson and would read the German translations of Emerson's essays, and there is so much commonality to their sentiment, and I love them both. Nietzsche is certainly the more controversial and probably the more well-known, but we can't forget that he was extremely inspired by Emerson, and that Emerson is a remarkable, and as he names one of his essays, representative human being, that his writings represent, and also he was a speaker, just his personality represented the highest human freedom, and he was a sort of luminary. All of these people I've mentioned in their own ways, luminaries, light posts showing the way to a higher existence that is tricky to get to, but it's perfectly there and available for human beings. We just tend to deny it, and we tend to give it over to, or to relinquish it to, all of these slaveries that are less than the highest mode of being. And the last on the list is Edward Edinger, scholar of Carl Gustav Jung. And what I like about Edinger is that, all of his work is centered around understanding Jung and commenting on Jung. That was his career, was to study and to relate the messages conveyed in Jung's works, which are not obvious, and it takes quite a bit of reading multiple of his books to really begin to understand the sort of opus or work that Jung is suggesting and the goal of that work. And I think I started to say something about Edinger that I didn't finish. What I like about Edinger is that he's kind of like the understandable friend that one has who is able to explain a tricky situation in intelligible terms that are easy to digest, so that you can have a comprehensive understanding of the full situation of what's going on when something very confusing may be happening. That he reduces Jung's works without doing any disservice to them, but rather enhancing their sentiment and explaining individuation in easier to understand terms. And the importance of this is individuation is tantamount to what in earlier ages one would call God's work. God's work carried out by the individual in the privacy of his own self-conscious interiority or internal existence. That, sure, we tend to dismiss this work, this inner spiritual work, as unreality, less than real, a kind of fiction or fantasy that people imagine themselves to be carrying out inside. But Edinger, as well as Jung, have their ways of communicating just how real this work is, and that it matters how engaged in it we are as subjects, or soul, if you like. That, after the manner of what I said before about Huxley's self-consciousness as a means to greater self-consciousness, that is precisely the message of individuation as I understand it, and that it's not something that just happens overnight or in one take, but it's continual, laborious, ongoing, inner and transcendental work that is invisible, that nobody sees, that's even so elusive that you might not recognize it going on, but it's going on nevertheless. And things begin to crop up in your experience, and your self-conscious experience begins to take on all of these various characters as you go through life. Various evolving characters that become more complex as you grow older, and it's up to us as subjects or consciousness at the back of this whole inner, mysterious, invisible drama to attend very carefully to it, and to notice when we've been placed out of our comfort zone, or even when twisted thoughts and feelings are popping up in us. I've read about half of this work, and I look forward to reading the remainder. But the problem, according to Edinger and to Jung, which brings people to therapy, is what they call alienation. And it's something like alienation from being itself or from the heart of life, which is in you and speaks in you, but that slips into forgetfulness, and it takes usually a sort of reminder in order to reconnect with the heart of being, and that's something like religious experience or transcendental experience of transcendental reality, as it is beyond you, that's independent of your personality or personal existence, but that is absolutely real. And it takes some reminder of this transcendental reality and experience of it, of the divine, or the numinous, one of Jung's favorite terms, which goes back, if I'm not wrong, to Rudolf Otto. And numen is a Latin term which refers to souls or a divine will, and one, therefore, to treat the problem of inner alienation has to have some experience of the divine will, or the transcendent, the ultra-real, the hyper-real, as it's sometimes called. That you may call it God or you may call it whatever you like. The word in the works of Jung and Edinger that you use to identify this or call it, it doesn't really matter. What matters is your real, living, subjective connection with that, whatever it is. And in putting it into words, we inevitably reduce the reality, but it's still there. And there are moments where we know it clearly and plainly, and we don't need it explained to us. In childhood, for instance, it's the most obvious of things. We live there. The transcendent is our reality, and we live in a sort of motherly or maternal womb of nature and are not insecure or unsure about our value or the value of life. But then we grow older, we become self-conscious, and we become self-conscious originally in this sort of crude and undeveloped manner where we do begin to doubt our worth and the value of life and existence and being, what have you. And we generally become very insecure, which is quite unlike childhood, and we wish that we could go back to childhood. And unbeknownst, the same fulfillment and confidence that we had as children is attainable by adults, insofar as they, by way of their self-consciousness that they come to develop in adolescent and adult years, attain to that womb of existence or heart of being, whatever you like, the transcendent fact of life itself. It's a possible experience, and it's what is supposed to cure or mitigate spiritual alienation, and thus you're actually content to be alive and are perhaps a charming and productive, giving human being as a result of your connection with the heart of life. And so I'll end it there. I really like Edinger, not for his poetry. His works are not meant really to be poetic. It's more, though there is an element of that as well, but it's just more his helping us to understand the behemoth or mastodon that Jung is. And anybody who doesn't read very much and just dives headlong into the collected works, the later year collected works of Jung, will just be terrified at how just how demanding his works are, and you're constantly looking things up and bending over backwards mentally to even begin to see the things that he's saying, though along the way, one begins to see what he's saying more readily, insofar as one has done the spiritual gymnastics to understand what one has read before. And so this video carried on longer than I wanted to, and I don't want it to carry on any longer than it has to. I'm going to end it here. Thank you guys.